everyone, Loremaster of Sotek here to talk about the upcoming DLC of Khorne, Greenskins, and Ogres some more. As in a prior video, we went over a lot of the Khornate stuff and what could be happening with Khorne, or what will be happening with Khorne, as of course CA did put out that lovely video of theirs showcasing a number of the things that are going to be coming in the DLC. But although it's been a hot second, I would like to continue said series by discussing today, as I'm sure you've guessed by the thumbnail, the Ogre Kingdoms. Now, before I do have one little brief just side announcement business to take care of real quick, which is that if you are a patron over on the Patreon, I have posted a pretty sizable chunk, like about 40 minutes of the upcoming quick head taker video, and I'm really looking for a lot of feedback on that. So I'm just kind of putting out if you're on there, please do pop into that post, give it a listen, give it a watch. I'd love to get your feedback on it. That way, I feel confident that we're going the right direction with it. But beyond that, let's go ahead and hop into discussing some Ogre goodies. So for the sake of this video, I think the best way to organize it will be to talk about the things that we know are going to be showing up in this upcoming DLC. Then talking about the things that are pretty likely, pretty much guaranteed to show up in this DLC. And then to finish off with the big maybes, the things that we hope to get and things that we might get, and giving a little bit of breathing room as far as choices go. So to hop right into it, our first thing is that we obviously know who the legendary lord is. Golgfag Maneater, the big bad mercenary captain of the Ogre Kingdoms, the individual from whom all other Maneaters take their title as Maneaters because they emulate this legendary ogre. For those curious, he actually gets the name Maneater as there was an incident once where he was running around essentially with a Dogs of War army, and the paymaster got in a dispute with him about payment. So Golgfag's response was to pick up said human, and he ate him in one bite. He just swallowed him whole, and then picked up the whole pay chest and ran away with it. And that gave him the moniker of Maneater, which Golgfag finds somewhat insulting because he does not even consider humans to be his preferred meal. Apparently, he thinks halflings are the most delectable choice. But what does he actually bring into the game? Well, first of all, Golgfag Maneater is an absolute beast at doing pretty much anything and everything. He's a very, very skilled fighter. He's very tough. He has exceptional skills with a whole different range of weapons. So he had a very unique special rule in tabletop called Easy Come, Easy Go. And basically the way it worked is at the start of the game, you would roll a random number that would give you a bunch of free gold, essentially, that you could use to purchase magic items that Golgfag would have for the rest of the game. And this was potentially really powerful, depending on what you rolled. But generally speaking, it could be pretty good because it allowed you to build him to counter your opponent. But that leaves him in a very unique position as far as legendary characters go, because he doesn't actually have any legendary magic items. Because he just doesn't really care about anything in particular. He just picks up random things as he goes and loses them, and et cetera, et cetera. So one of the things that'll be really interesting with him is how his gameplay is going to work, based on the little clip that we've seen of, and I'll be sure in the video that we have like the footage we've seen of these characters and units pop up. But based on what we've seen of him so far, it looks like he's going to be primarily, a melee character, being out there with his dual hand weapons, just kind of smashing people apart. I would love if he has some ability to use a ranged weapon, as in tabletop, you could give him certain kinds of ranged melee weapons, which would allow him to then, pew pew at things. But it's not strictly necessary. It'd be nice for like an ability, but it's not necessarily required for, anything beyond that, I think. It'd be nice to see him like maybe be able to like take out a crossbow and shoot someone or something like that. But I don't know if they're going to bother with that, as long as he's fun to play with. As far as his actual mechanics go, the big thing with Golgfag is that he should take your Maneaters and just dial them up to 13, right? He was quite powerful in tabletop if you took Maneaters because he gave them several special rules that they normally had to pay for free, which allowed them to buy other big special rules much cheaper. So the thing I think I would really like to see with him is that from a faction side, he, improves Maneaters across the board for his faction, but also allows the Maneaters in his army to get some ridiculously powerful buffs. I kind of think of the way Oxiodal works, where Oxiodal already makes the skinks in his army very powerful, but then he gets those unique attachments that he can give to certain skink units, and it just makes them into living gods, right? Where he gives them like the different toxins that just make them absolutely horrific. I think it'd be really cool to see Golgfag do something similar, where he gets different equipable like banners or upgrades essentially that you then apply to the Maneaters in your army. And there are two ways you could do it, where you could make it related to skills in his skill tree. So the abilities maybe aren't as powerful, but they give you some nice, very general skills for the whole army. So like, all of your Maneaters have poisoned attacks, or all of your Maneaters have a bonus to anti-large, or all of your Maneaters have Vanguard deployment, things like that. Or they could do, like I said, the Oxiodal method, where he only gets like 4 unique upgrades, but they're extremely powerful. Instead of just being, poison attacks, it's like, these guys get the kind of poison that deals damage over time and also unleashes other debuffs. This group gets disruption attacks, so when they hit enemies, they like completely knock out all of their active abilities and things like that. Ultimately, though, the big thing I'd also like to see for Golgfag, obviously coming with all the Ogre reworks, is really leaning into the mercenary contract system and hopefully making that really exciting. With the whole idea that he's able to find magic items really easily, it also would be nice if he has just a crazy magic item find chance. Not necessarily, magic steal chance would be fine too, but just the ability that whenever he fights, he generates magic items from the battle would be very, very, very nice, just to make him able to just pump those out like crazy. But ultimately, as far as the Maneater is concerned, I think he's gonna not be, super necessarily crazy, but overall just a fun gimmick character that applies a lot of unique ideas to the ogres. I'm far more interested in like the rest of what's going to be coming with him, in addition to the free LC kind of updates to the faction, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. But let's keep going with the things that we know are going to be in the DLC, and then we'll swing back around to talking about some faction stuff. So the next thing that we saw demonstrated is that we know we're getting Thundertusks. So the Thundertusk is a really gigantic monster that's up there with the Stonehorn, where it's absolutely massive and it's very, very gnarly in combat, but it's not quite as durable and just outright offensive as the Stonehorn is. But it makes up for that with being more of a support ranged focused monster. So where the Stonehorn is purely focused on combat, other than, like the riders having harpoon launchers, or if you have a hunter on the back, he throws javelins. But other than that, it's, a big stomping monster. It's very tough. It has a massive amount of health. What you have with the Thundertusk is that it also has a lot of health, but it doesn't have nearly as much armor, and it's not quite as deadly in combat. However, it makes up for this in 2 big ways. The first is that it has 2 riders instead of just 1. And in the original design, one of them will have what's called a chain trap, which is quite literally like a giant bear trap attached to a chain that the ogres fling around their heads, almost like a lasso, and throw at people so that it, hits someone and chomps closed on them, and then the ogre can reel them in to then get their chow down on, which I just love as a concept. I would love to see the chain traps be added to the game. They could get away with just doing like harpoon launchers and like spears or javelins. That wouldn't be a huge deal, but it would be really cool to see the chain traps. It would just make for some really fun animations and add in kind of a unique short range shooting attack. Though I imagine part of me feels like it almost functioned more in melee, but beyond the fact that you have the 2 Ogre Riders who are providing like lots of good shooting stuff, the Thundertusk itself has a shooting attack where it has this ability called Frost Wreath Ice or Frost Wreath Orbs, where basically the Thundertusk is such a living embodiment of cold. It's such a living embodiment of just frost and like the absolute depths of the cold that can be found up in the mountains of Morn, that it can freeze the air to a horrific extent just by breathing, because it's essentially got kind of like magical ice running through its blood almost. And what the Thundertusk can do is it can create these orbs of just like nightmarishly cold frost that it then uses its tusks to hurl, kind of like a catapult, and it throws these orbs over the battlefield that will slam into units and explode, getting everyone to get horrible frostbite and freeze to death and all sorts of other stuff. So it would be really great to see that ability represented in game, you know, with it essentially kind of having fairly, it's not like crazy long range, although it fires similar to catapult shot, it was notably shorter range than that. But it could hurt pretty bad. So it would be very, very nice to see this, the Sphere of Frost Wreath Ice really be a kind of almost like the Troglodon spit attack, but, you know, hopefully it has an arc rather than firing in a straight line. But just, you know, a fun, unique shooting attack from the monster where he's just hurling these orbs of frost over the battlefield to impact units and deal lots of anti-large damage. Because the way it worked is that it really relied heavily on dealing multi-wounds by getting like direct hits on things. So I could see it probably having an anti-large, but maybe it's not heavily armor piercing. But of course, the big thing is that it would apply frostbite. Then, of course, for the big beastie itself, decent combat fighter, but it has an aura of frost, which is really nice, very similar to the Frost Phoenix. So I suspect it'll probably be borderline the exact same, where it'll just have an AoE debuff aura that if you get too close to it, you know, it's lowering like melee attack and weapon strength, which is very, very strong. So I do think it's going to be a really powerful addition to the Ogre Kingdom's roster. You know, there's just another big terror-causing high health monster, but where the Stonehorn, you would have to capitalize really well on like, oh, I need to make sure I'm getting in my hardcore cycle charges and relying heavy on damage. The Thundertusk is nice because he can work as a really powerful debuff piece that doesn't necessarily need to be fighting the entire time, which allows for more options, which is always good. Beyond that, the last unit that we had revealed for sure for this, the Ogre parts of the DLC, are the Blood Vultures. Now, the Blood Vultures were a particularly interesting pick because they are not traditionally an actual unit for the Ogre Kingdoms. The Blood Vulture was an upgrade that you could take on your hunters that allowed them to perform kind of a specialized shooting attack, essentially, as they would they would have this trained pet bird that they could kind of like send at people and it would harass them or hurt certain individuals and stuff like that. But obviously, Creative Assembly has upgraded it to a full unit. And I think that bluntly, this is an excellent idea. The Blood Vulture was definitely high on my list of creatures I really hope to see, because it gives the Ogre Kingdoms access to a new dynamic in battles, which is going to be very, very helpful for them, which is a flying monstrous beast unit, which is very, very nice. So I suspect it's pretty much just going to operate like Carrion, except for, unlike Carrion, it's not undead. So instead of, you know, breaking down, it'll just flee from combat once it's been defeated. I don't think that they'll be like the scariest things ever, but they'll probably cause fear. You know, they'll be very, very good at getting onto the exposed units that don't have a lot of armor and really tearing them apart, getting on your opponent's war machines, their archers, flying into like the rears or flanks of already engaged enemies. I'm kind of expecting that they might have some kind of special rule gimmick as the idea of Blood Vultures, in that maybe they'll have a special bonus if they are attacking units that are breaking or already fleeing from combat, or have bonuses at attacking enemies that are kind of already broken. Because, you know, vultures, the idea behind them, you know, Blood Vultures being that they're opportunistic attackers. They're really able to take advantage and prey on things that aren't really in a good position to fight back against them. But there are some fun things they could do with this unit, just because, like I said, they don't actually have a tabletop profile as far as looking at what special rules they might have and trying to calculate their various stats. So that does allow CA to really play around with them. I think for me personally, I really hope they just go much more the harassment route. I expect that they'll actually have surprisingly good weapon strength, but the counter to that will be that they likely will not have much in the way of the melee attack and melee defense department. So relatively squishy, decent health pool, but I actually think in some ways they'll work better than the Carrion, which I think will be the easiest contemporaries of theirs, because they can break from combat. So instead of just you throw them into combat and they pretty much get engaged and start immediately crumbling and falling apart, instead you're able to throw them into combat, they do some fighting, and then they fall back. And more than likely they will rally so that you're able to get more use out of them later in the battle, unless your opponent manages to just really mess them up or dedicates them to chasing them off, which can make them just excellent. And considering that a lot of the Ogre army building mechanics revolve very heavily around dealing damage and killing enemy models that are fleeing from combat, Blood Vultures I really think will be a must-have in quite a few Ogre builds, because they'll make chasing down fleeing units and getting that damage in to really build up your various Ogre army abilities so much easier. I'm really looking forward to seeing the Blood Vultures, and I also hope that the Hunter generic hero gets upgrades to his skill tree, where if you go look at the Hunter right now, he gets all these abilities to buff Saber Tusks. I really hope they add Blood Vultures to all of those upgrades. So instead of just upgrading Saber Tusk units, he's also upgrading the Blood Vulture units, because they're another kind of feral beast unit that's being added to the roster that's associated with Hunters, which is going to be really exciting. So that wraps up the things we know for sure that we're getting, which leaves us with the things we might be getting, but I feel pretty certain we're going to get. So once again, these are not confirmed, but I feel like they're pretty much shoo-ins. The first is our legendary hero option. There is actually only one character left in the Ogre Kingdom's army book who we don't have in the game yet, and that would be Bragg the Gutsman. And he is actually a pretty cool character. So the idea behind Bragg is that he is a gutsman. For those that don't know, is the ogre term for an executioner. Because think of it like a headsman. So instead of a headsman, he's a gutsman. Because where a human executioner tends to deal in decapitations or things that involve taking your head, a ogre executioner takes the guts of his fellow ogres, and he has this giant two-handed sickle on a chain. So he's got this big staff, and at the end of the staff is this big old chain. At the end of the chain is this giant, wicked-looking hook. And what Bragg figured out he could do with it is that when he's fighting non-ogres, he's able to just kind of flick it around. And with the strength of an ogre, he's easily able to just decapitate people and rip their limbs off and stuff by flicking it around, like just an absolutely nightmarish flail glaive hybrid weapon. But when he fights other ogres, he's able to slam it into their gut plates, and it basically acts like a can opener, where it stabs into the top of their stomach above their gut plate, and then just spins around and pulls down, and it hooks into their intestines and rips them out, which for ogres is the most agonizing way to die possible. It is a slow death, and it is a painful death, because all of an ogre's organs are in their stomach, and it takes a long time for them to disembowel compared to most other species. So ogres are terrified of him. But as far as what he does, other than just having a really cool aesthetic because of his giant sickle weapon, and he wears a big leather hood, just like a very classic headsman or executioner does, the black leather hood. He's basically a hardcore character killer. On top of just being an ogre with very impressive combat abilities, who's well designed to deal significant armor piercing damage and just tear through elite enemy units. The big thing is that he excels at butchering enemy characters. So I heavily suspect that he will essentially kind of be your assassin character in a melee scenario, where he's able to get close to enemy heroes and either hit them with like a big debuff ability that makes them more vulnerable, like Wolfric style of fighting, or he might have a way to root them down, like we see with Deathmaster Snitch, or he may just have a passive ability that activates when he's near enemy characters that just makes him way scarier and more dangerous, kind of like how we see with Grimgor Ironhide. So there's a lot of different ways they can interpret Bragg's abilities that represent him being a hardcore character assassin, because in tabletop, generally the way you like to use him is you try to get him into a challenge with an enemy character, because he would get heroic killing blow, which is very scary. And if he kills an enemy character in a challenge, he would also give the disrupted effect to all enemies within a certain distance, which means that he would basically disable a lot of their leadership stuff. So one thing that could be really cool for him is that if I don't know how I would suspect that the way they would actually do this is just give him a passive where he just like deals leadership debuffs as long as he's in combat. That'll probably be the easier way to do it. But it would be cool if they had it in a way where if he kills an enemy character, he gets like a big nasty like leadership nuke to really punch his enemies nearby. But I suspect to keep things simpler and easier to use, especially for players, they'll just make it where he has some kind of leadership debuff ability, either like an active power where he activates and it causes like a doom and darkness type debuff, or it'll be a passive where as long as he's in combat and he's fighting, he causes big leadership debuffs. But for ogres, leadership debuff is always fantastic. That is never bad for them, as it really synergizes well with the fact that they have so much fear and terror causing. So that's Bragg the Gutsman. I heavily suspect he'll be our legendary hero, who will be available to all of the Ogre Kingdom factions, and I really look forward to seeing him. I'm hoping he's who we're going to get for that. Then we have the generic hero, which is the Bruiser, which Bragg the Gutsman, for those curious, is technically a bruiser himself. Bruisers are essentially just the big bullies. They're the hero level tyrant. So they're often the enforcers of the various tyrants, or the rulers of very smaller tribes that don't have enough individuals to really be considered a full enough tribe to be declared a tyrant. But they enforce a lot of the rules, are in charge of various roles, and are often the right hand individuals to the tyrants. They don't come with any like unique special rule gimmicks in the base tabletop, but I'm sure Creative Assembly will come up with some fun ideas about how to do them. The biggest thing about them in tabletop that made them fun was that bruisers were very heavily customizable, in that you could give them iron fists, you could give them great weapons, they could wield two-hand weapons, they could have pistols. So it'd be fun to kind of see them take a bit of a unique design. With tyrants, the tyrants that we have are the dual wielding type. So I'm kind of expecting the bruisers to either be wielding great weapons, and maybe that allows them to have, the hunter has the big anti-large focus. So maybe you don't need the bruiser to have a big anti-large focus. I don't know. They could go for like a hybridized build. Like maybe he's got a big club or cleaver in one hand. He's got an ogre pistol in the other hand. So he kind of matches the sort of Maneater aesthetic a bit. But there's a lot of different ways they could build him. I suspect he'll probably have various ways to buff leadership. He'll probably have unique interactions to buff your regular ogre bulls, your man-eaters, and your iron guts. I imagine those are the units he'll synergize really well with, and it'll be fun to see like what kind of abilities they give on a skill tree to allow you to differentiate him. Typically they go like, you go down one of three routes. So like I could see one route where he's maybe an enforcer, where it's more about he buffs like the tyrant and he buffs the like the other characters in the army, and maybe he provides leadership buffs and really leans into being like the head of the iron guts. And then you have another version where he's more of like a challenger or someone that's threatening your tyrant. So, you could kind of go with the idea of like the Skaven Chieftain thing, where he has a leadership ability that activates if the tyrant dies or flees the battle, where he kind of stabilizes the ogre leadership. And he's much more of like, I'm going to get out there and fight and kill people because I want to prove that I'm the best. I'm the hardest. There's a lot of fun ways they can play around with it. But the Bruiser, I think, will be a much appreciated character, especially because he'll be much more heavily armored than the Hunter or the Butcher. Or the Firebelly, for that matter. So having a more defensive focused character that's much more geared around leadership, survivability, and tankiness, along with, just good getting into combat and beating the crap out of people damage, should be really good. Then the next thing that I really, really hope we're going to get with this update, though I suspect this should be part of a free LC aspect, coming along with the Ogre Kingdoms and their rework, is that we need to get the 2 missing lores of magic for the Ogre Kingdoms, which is that the Butchers and the Slaughtermasters are supposed to have access to the lore of Death and the lore of Heavens. Right now, they only have access to the lore of the Great Maw and the lore of Beasts, which is really lame and really dumb, and I don't understand why they did that in the first place, because it just made those particular roles way more narrow than they needed to be. Heavens and Death will be very, very nice additions, in my opinion, to the Ogre Kingdoms roster. Death in particular is going to synergize so well with Ogres. The ability to, like, dropping a big Doom and Darkness to cause big leadership debuffs, being able to give yourself easy access to magic attacks by using Aspect of the Dread Knight, or, obviously Fate of Buna is never bad, nor is Spirit Leech. Those are 2 of the best spells because they give you such reliable access to getting rid of particular kinds of enemies, which is always really good. And Lore of Heavens also synergizes really, really well with Ogres. Harmonic Convergence, bringing in some really easy, reliable buffs. Wind Blast is good for getting low-tier spearmen out of the way and knocking them all over and dealing good damage to them, as well as lower-tier unarmored archers and such. Uranus Thunderbolt's great for blowing up war machines. Comet of Katsandora you can never go wrong with, dealing just lots of damage to lots of different targets. There's just a lot of really good things there. So hopefully we'll get those 2 missing lores on our Butchers and our Slaughtermasters, though I believe that should be part of just the Ogre Kingdoms update as opposed to the actual DLC itself. Then for the last thing that I feel like we're definitely going to get, like no argument, we're getting it, are the Yhetees. Yhetees are one of the things that I'm frankly the most excited for in this DLC because they're old. The Yhetees that we have in the actual tabletop game are the original Yeti models. So we have the same Yhetees now that we got back in like 2006 or 2004, whenever the first Ogre Kingdoms book came out in 6th edition. So to be honest, they are hideously ugly and they look terrible. So I'm really, really excited to see what the update's going to look like, based on how good of a job Total War did taking like the Gorgers and updating them, which then Games Workshop almost seemed to be inspired by, and also released brand new Gorger models, which are very pretty. I hope they do the same thing with the Yhetees, where the Yhetees look absolutely horrible on their actual tabletop minis. Their artwork is really pretty, especially from like the 8th edition army book. They had really, really pretty artwork. But what do Yhetees bring to the table? Well, a couple of really interesting things. They are really designed to be very, very swift, hardcore flankers that barely have anything in regards to armor, but they make up for it with debuffs and speed. So the big gimmicks for them is that they have a slightly worse version of the Aura of Frost compared to the Thundertusk. So if you think of the Thundertusk as being on par with like the Frost Phoenix, right? Where it has this like good AoE debuff aura that lowers like melee attack and weapon strength and all that stuff. The Yhetees have one that requires them to be in combat. So it'll likely be either very, very short range debuff, or it might be applied to their attacks. But they do have a unique debuff where they would essentially lower the melee attack of enemies, as opposed to melee attack and damage. So it's not quite as good. But they do have that Frost Aura, which is a nice debuff. And the other thing they have is, obviously, they would have Frostbite attacks. So when they're hitting people, they're slowing them down. And they have magic damage, which is never a bad thing. Magic damage for the Ogre Kingdoms is always great, especially if you're fighting a lot of demons, which you often are as the ogres. So Yhetees give you that really nice, easy access to, they all have magic attacks, they all have frostbite attacks, so they're good at getting into the enemy's flanks and rears and just smashing them apart and cutting through physical resistance like butter. The other thing about them is that it'll be interesting to see how they design their clubs. So Yhetees wield these clubs that have these big old like frost heads on them because the Yhetees just kind of exude aura of cold that makes everything around them freeze, and the ice becomes magically infused and real nasty and stuff. But the Yhetees have been kind of inconsistent about whether the clubs are big two-handed clubs or one-handed clubs, kind of like what we see with the trolls. I'm thinking they're going to lean more towards the one-handed club design. That way they kind of like, they have one hand free and they're kind of like running around almost looking like big great apes as they slam into combat, and they're like swinging one hand around and crushing people with their big like Yeti claws and stuff. I'm not expecting them to be two-handed mauls, but one-handed mauls, but we'll see. They could do either one and I'd be like, yeah, cool, whatever. So I'm very excited to see the Yhetees. I adore the Yhetees of Warhammer Fantasy. They're grossly underappreciated in my opinion. But it's like their models are just hideous. So it'll be really nice to see them get some love. All right, that takes us out of the pretty much guaranteed section and into the big maybes, as I call them. So the big maybes are that if we know that this upcoming DLC is going to use the Tarmacon and Shadows of Change format, which means there's a legendary lord, a legendary hero, a generic lord, a generic hero, and then 5 units. So far, we've really locked down our legendary lord with Golgfag Maneater, our legendary hero, Bragg the Gutsman, our generic hero, the Bruiser, and then Yhetees, Thundertusks, and Blood Vultures. So that means we have a generic lord to discuss and 2 additional units to discuss. So starting with the generic lord, I believe there's 2 directions they can go with this. And it depends on kind of what their goal is. If the goal is to kind of follow the typical standard of making a lord that is very much similar to the legendary lord, then the obvious thing to do would be a Maneater captain. So a Maneater captain could be really fun and exciting. You know, that would allow them to come out with a ogre lord who has a shooting attack. You know, he's got like a pistol of some kind, or like a brace of pistols or whatever, and then he could have really anything as a melee weapon. It could be as exotic or not as they want. So he could have like a big 2-handed weapon, and he could be very Empire themed, or he could be very Cathayan themed, or he could just look very exotic and wild. Because with your man-eaters, you really want them to look super crazy. And it would be really fun to get a Maneater Lord who really allows you to spec your Maners in unique ways. He would be able to have tons of customization options of like, I could see him having like 3 minor skill trees that give you 2 choices. And if you pick one, it like locks the other. It's like, okay, do you want him to have Vanguard deployment, or do you want him to have poison attacks? Or do you want him to have like a shooting buff, like the snipe effect or stalk, for instance? Or do you want him to be unbreakable? Or do you want him to have an anti-large bonus on all of his attacks? Or do you want him to have an anti-infantry bonus on all his attacks? Like, there are different really fun ways you can play around with it. And he can lean into buffing different kinds of units, though obviously revolving more around man-eaters. And could also have some really fun gimmicks as far as how he interacts with other factions. One of the things I've been really pushing for with Creative Assembly would be really reworking literally all the lords in the game by giving all lords just a selection of skills in their skill tree that buffs allied units in their army. But the Maneater captain, I would expect, would lean very heavily into buffing allied units. Kind of like how the Changeling does, really making allied units feel super strong, because that would just be very appropriate, in my opinion. But So there's a lot of customization there, a lot of fun, and it gives us, a nice, well-rounded group of ogre lords, where you've got the tyrant, who's like your big melee beat stick, who's, heavily armored, lots of health, really tough, and could just get in there against literally anybody and just fight. And then you've got your Slaughtermaster, if you want to go the magic route, with different kinds of like buffs and lots of health and all that stuff. And then you'd have your Maneater captain, who is your melee range hybrid, offers all sorts of really weird, unique buffs and a really dynamic character. Then stick with me. All right, this is a little crackpot. Okay, this is very crackpot because I feel like that would be the safe and correct choice. But there is another choice that I don't think is a bad choice. It's just a little bizarre, which is the Gnoblar head honcho. So the Gnoblar head honcho originates from a White Dwarf article magazine that gave rules for the Gnoblar horde, which was basically if you could run an army of just all Gnoblars, and it added a bunch of units and characters and stuff. And the lord choice for these armies was the head honcho. And Gnoblar head honchos are surprisingly scary. They are able to take flails or spears. They actually fight pretty well. They're pretty on par with like a goblin war boss. And the big thing about them, beyond like, they can have like a sling for shooting attacks. But the big thing about them is they can ride a Rhinox. So you would get them as a super duper cheap, just kind of basic bitch lord that would kind of be up there with like your red crested skink lord or your night goblin war boss lord, where they start off kind of meh. But if he would get access to the Rhinox really fast. And once he's up on a Rhinox, it's not just him. There's also like several other Gnoblars up there with him. And he becomes basically your big monstrous mounted character, where because of the Rhinox, he's now bigger than the rest of your ogres, which could make for a pretty fun, goofy character. He is very goofy, is kind of the big thing. Though you could lean him very heavily into buffing the hell out of your Gnoblars, similar to how, your Night Goblin War Boss can buff the hell out of like your Squigs and your Night Goblins. So he could really lean into taking care of all of your Gnoblars and really add a very new dynamic playstyle with your armies. They would definitely have to be creative as far as like what he's capable of and how he fights and stuff. It is very funny to imagine him just running around with a sling that it does like surprising damage because he's a single entity with a sling, just being like, ha! Just throwing a rock and killing like 3 Empire Greatswords per shot, which would be hilarious to see. But once he's up on the Rhinox, it's like, okay, that's actually reasonably terrifying because Rhinox they're huge. So that is the other option. I will say that I think for the Ogre Kingdoms as a faction, the mercenary or the Maneater captain just works better. And he also synergizes better with what Golgfag is going to bring to the table. However, I don't think the head honcho should be completely like, oh, that's terrible. Like, I do think there's a lot of really cool potential there, especially with the last 2 units we're going to talk about, because I'll say that I very strongly believe that the last 2 units of the DLC will be Gnoblar units. It's just a matter of what Gnoblar units they will be. So this could work well in that the head honcho would synergize very, very well with that aspect of the roster. So getting to those units, what do we have? The one that I really hope we get, like the Gnoblar unit that I am praying we get access to because they would synergize so well with this DLC, would be Gnoblar Manbiters. So Manbiters are very, very buff Gnoblars that actually wear a surprising amount of armor by Gnoblar standards, and they carry these big old flails. So they are flail melee infantry, and they're Gnoblars that emulate the Maneaters, and in many cases will actually pack up and follow Maneaters around. So because they're the biggest, scrappiest Gnoblars, they get pick of the best loot. And because they often fall around like Maneaters and stuff, they end up going to all sorts of crazy exotic places, learning to actually fight surprisingly well, and they get access to, they like piecemeal themselves together decent armor, and they've got those big flails, so they have like a really high nasty charge bonus, and when they get into combat they can really mess people up on that charge. Flails are criminally underrepresented in Total War Warhammer, in my opinion. So getting a really nice flail infantry with the Gnoblar horde, I think would be absolutely spectacular. And they're still Gnoblars, so they're not that great at fighting, but giving your Gnoblar units a more elite initial unit, something that is at the high tier of your Gnoblars that's able to have, with their flails, I could see it either being that they either have surprisingly high base damage with like a good charge bonus, or that they actually do have some decent armor piercing damage, but also have a pretty good charge bonus. Because, with flails, the idea being that when they get into combat, the flails at the start of the combat are pretty devastating, but the longer they fight, it kind of falls off. So I really, really hope we get to see them. I think they'd make a spectacular addition to the Ogre Kingdoms roster, especially giving access to like a much more sturdy Gnoblar unit that you could have in your armies to get above just regular Gnoblars. Where the Manbiters have much better leadership than regular Gnoblars. They have much better combat stats than regular Gnoblars and much better armor. So they actually have, a good bit more staying power, which would just make them, I think, feel much, much better and fun. And, there's still like a ton of them in a unit. They're by no means like, oh, there's like significantly less of them. No, there's still like a horde. They had a gigantic minimum unit size in the Gnoblar Horde army list where you had to have at least 20 of them per unit, which is a lot for tabletop. But beyond that, so that's the one I hope for sure that we get. But then there's one more slot, and I really think it's between two types of Gnoblar, depending on what role we want filled. If you want to go the more like reasonable role, so like, what's a realistic addition that would add something useful for the Ogre Kingdoms? You do have the Flingers. So Flinger Gnoblars, they're pretty much what they are in the 10. They are Gnoblars that have slings. So they have notably more range than the Gnoblar Trappers, who just have throwing knives. So these, they would essentially be Skaven Slave Slingers, right? So they have longer range. There's a whole bunch of them. They, throw slings. They would be a very low tier unit. They would be down there with your regular Gnoblars at tier 1, but they would give the ogres access to a really cheap tier 1 shooting unit, which would be really, really good for the Ogre Kingdoms. Like for the sake of like balanced builds, especially in campaign, they would get some pretty hefty mileage, I think, of being able to be a nice spammable unit where you have 4, 5, 6 of them in an army, especially in the early campaign or when an army is newly formed, and they provide just a ton of use. Obviously you would phase them out, probably rather quickly at some point, but just like Skaven Slave Slingers, they could just be really, really useful in a lot of circumstances, especially in multiplayer. The other option that is along a similar route are the Blood Gnoblars. So Blood Gnoblars, so instead of where the Gnoblar Flingers would be like a significantly less impressive shooting Gnoblar unit, they're a lower tier, like a tier 1 garbage quality unit. There's just a lot of them. They just give you shooting. There is a higher tier Gnoblar shooting unit that's like Gnoblar Trappers, but just more powerful, which are the Blood Gnoblars. And the Blood Gnoblars are basically, these are the Gnoblars that live up in the peaks of the Mountains of Morn and hunt the various beasts and creatures. And they hunt like humans and hunt like all sorts of nasty, dangerous things. And they're really good at setting traps. And the Gnoblar Trappers are actually attempting to emulate the Blood Gnoblars. The Blood Gnoblars being the ones that develop these techniques and this knowledge, and they occasionally come down from the mountain peaks to join in on the fights and stuff, and they're really, really, really nasty. As far as what they would bring to the table, they would just be very elite trappers. So they would be better at stealthing. They would have their cunning traps rule where their traps would be better than the regular Gnoblar trappers. So they would either deal more damage or they would be able to genuinely like pin enemy units in place. So they would just be Gnoblar trappers, but better, better missile damage, better combat stats, better leadership, all that stuff. Not very exciting, but functional. I'll be honest that I think that the Flingers would be better than the Blood Gnoblars, just because the Flingers actually would fulfill a role that would be very, very helpful to the Ogres as a whole. However, before we get too sold on a shooting unit, there is another option that kind of falls under the same umbrella as the head honcho, in that it's stupid, but it's so stupid that it's charming. And that is the Pigback Riders. So for those unaware, in the Gnoblar hordes, there is a unit called the Pigback Rider. And what they are is that in Gnoblar country and in the various Ogre Kingdom tribe, where the tribes like set up camps, Gnoblars have a sport of pigback riding, where basically you'll have two Gnoblars that'll set up across some, either like from the center of the camp, or if they're down in the Gnoblar country, down some lanes or mud or whatever. And each Gnoblar wrangles a pig, and they get on the pig, and they basically oh my gosh, I can't remember what it's called, but they do that thing where knights run at each other and try and hit each other with their lances to unhorse them. Joust. There we go. Jousting. So it's pig jousting, right? They ride pigs at one another and they try and joust each other, and it's hilarious and good fun. However, something that the Gnoblars quickly discovered when going on to the battlefields is that the pigs refused to go into battle. They would like squeal and lose their shit and just run off the battlefield, running over any Gnoblars that got in their way and just being, not helpful. So what the Gnoblars decided to do, being the innovative little bastards they are, is rather than riding a pig into battle, they would just ride each other into battle. So the Pigback Riders is actually kind of a double joke in that they are actual pigback riders, in that they ride on pigs recreationally, but in battle they are piggyback riders, in that they are giving each other piggybacks. And it's basically two Gnoblars with one sitting on top of the other, and the bottom one is just going and just running forward into battle, while the top one is holding a spear and a shield, being a glorious knight riding his best mate into battle. So they're very, very goofy. They were hilariously treated as a hybridized infantry cavalry unit, and that they only had the movement speed of infantry, but they did get cavalry rules for using spears on the charge, which is absolutely hilarious. So they would be just very, very goofy. They counted as spears for all intents and purposes in tabletop, and they had higher armor because they had shields, and they also were mounted technically, so they got the mounted bonus as well. So these would basically be medium armor. They wouldn't be they'd actually technically be more well armored than the Manbiters, but they're reasonably armored Gnoblars with bronze shields that would probably have anti-large, because they're supposed to have all of the regular spear bonuses. Like, they're supposed to have the charge reflection rule, they're supposed to have the defense against large rule, and they're supposed to have the charge, because remember, they're an infantry cavalry hybrid, so their spears, according to the rules, according to the piggyback special rule, which is a hilarious special rule, but according to the piggyback special rule, they got to use their spears as if they were both cavalry and infantry. So if you charge them, they got all the benefits with their spears as if they were an infantry unit, in that they got to fight in additional ranks and yada, yada, yada. But if they charged you, they got all of the spear buffs as if they were cavalry, meaning they got the bonus damage. So theoretically, in Total War, that would mean that they should have a surprisingly high charge bonus like spear cavalry do, but they should also have charge defense against large and charge reflection when braced, which I think is just hilarious and would make them a very goofy, gimmicky unit. And they should also have anti-large, though. Their stats would still be pretty terrible. They still would not be impressive by any means of the imagination, but they would be admittedly very, very fun. Very, very goofy, stupid fun. So there's that. In any event, that brings us to the end of the DLC stuff. As far as the free DLC stuff goes, I think I will save that for its own video. Because I don't want this to drag on too much longer, because I know I've already been rambling forever. So let's go ahead and call this video here, and we'll talk more about free LC stuff later on. But please do let me know what y'all think about these predictions and hopes down in the comment section below. In particular, I'd really like to know which of the big maybes you would pick. Like, are you on team Maneater Captain, or are you on team Gnoblar Head Honcho? And then between the Gnoblar Manbiters, the Pigback Riders, the Flingers, and the Blood Gnoblars, which two between those four do you think should be the extra models included alongside the Yhetees, the Blood Vultures, and the Thundertusks? And feel free to let me know anything else that really caught your interest or attention during the video. And we'll be back to talk about greenskins real soon, as well as free LC changes and all that stuff. So thank you all very much for watching. I appreciate it. And just to shamelessly plug again that please swing by the Patreon if you are a patron to check out the Queek video, and please give me some feedback on that. I really appreciate it. I love your faces. Thank you so much for watching. Have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.